Final Fantasy VII, a game that some regard as the best Final Fantasy. Some may even credit its success as to why the new contender, the Sony PlayStation, defeated the veteran Nintendo in the console wars. This was a game that shortly started development after the completion of Final Fantasy VI by series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, but not for the PlayStation, but rather the Super Nintendo. The pathway between these two machines was a long and fluctuating hurdle that Sakaguchi and the team at Squaresoft had to face in creating one of the most iconic games in existence. This is a story of a team that had to burn bridges, change platforms twice, learn the hurdles of developing in the third dimension for the first time, constantly changing a story that even once begun in real-life New York City, along with evolving or cutting characters, maps, and features, while also having to deal with much troubled localization that almost even led to the censorship of this very game, all in an effort to make a dream game that can also be the first Final Fantasy game, if not the first Japanese RPG to sell well in the West. And so today, we shall explore this story in completion, the complete history and beta unused content of Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VI had just released in 1994 worldwide exclusively on the Super Nintendo, a game that the creator of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, considered as the greatest game in the universe. However, despite that, while the game was a commercial success in Japan, it was not so much in the West. But this was normal at the time, as many RPGs in the West had minimal success, with gaming being rather limited to a select audience of children and teenagers that weren't so much into text-heavy RPGs, and the market was also not so mainstream yet. However, the developers at Squaresoft sought to continue on and make the next game in the series, Final Fantasy VII. Being that it was 1994, the Super Nintendo still had some life left within it, and so the target platform was clear for Squaresoft, with the first 6 entries finding modest to outstanding success on these Nintendo platforms. The 7th Fantasy was to also be another entry for it. As such, plans started out for Final Fantasy VII as yet another 2D entry and went as far as to even develop a 2D prototype too. Up to this point, Final Fantasy games had all taken place in a medieval fantasy setting, with Final Fantasy VI starting to introduce mechanical figures into the game too. This time, however, Sakaguchi envisioned a game that took place within the real world, New York City in the year 1999. The story involved a group of characters that were on a quest to destroy New York's reactors that pumped the planet's life energy known as Mako in their pursuit to save the planet, but would lead to the team to eventually blowing up the whole city. Meanwhile, all this was happening while being pursued by a detective simply known as Joe. But eventually, development was put on hold as Sakaguchi and the team went on to finish Chrono Trigger on the SNES. At this point, it was now 1995, and the next generation of consoles were either released or coming out soon. Nintendo, in this case, was starting to push the idea of their new console, the Ultra 64, to the public and many of its third-party partner developers in order to start developing games. For Sakaguchi and the team, this was a big step for them to make. They had already been comfortable with the 2D prototype, so they made a strategy on either continuing on and getting the game done in a timely manner versus the idea of basically restarting development and following the trend that everyone else was by going fully 3D. The decision was clear. Take the riskier 3D path on a next generation console. The Nintendo 64 was the clear option for Final Fantasy VII, with both Squaresoft's clear good ties with Nintendo and how their game had shared modest success, even if not so much in the West. Their plan was to make a Final Fantasy game that would truly be a leap into the third dimension, with everything from massive maps to well put together cutscenes. And so Sakaguchi and the team decide to run some tests using machines they bought from Silicon Graphics Inc., the very corporation that was developing the GPU for the N64. An excellent test to see how the game would function on the N64 graphics before full development can begin. This test utilized Final Fantasy VI characters in a battle against a golem. One of Sakaguchi's biggest fears by going 3D was how unsure he was at what 3D battles would look like. This test showed how cinematic and well put together battles can be in the third dimension, despite it being turn-based combat. And so this tech demo was later shown in 1995 at the annual SIGGRAPH conference in Los Angeles, labeled as Final Fantasy VI, the interactive CG game. Of course, media outlets blew this tech demo to huge proportions. Magazines such as GameFan literally labeled it as actual screenshots of a game currently in development for Nintendo's Ultra 64, despite it being Final Fantasy VI characters on screen, a trend that would plague Final Fantasy VII again many years down the road. However, while the tech demo was very well received, when the team sat down to actually make the game on the N64 hardware, a string of problems were soon realized. Real-time tests began to see how well the N64 could achieve their plans for this gargantuan game. One thing Final Fantasy VII is well known for is the drastic shift from simple low-poly overworld models on a pre-rendered background to battles featuring high-poly models duking it out with a cinematic camera. During this test, this very transition to high-poly models was just simply not working out, as the N64 had difficulty rendering these models at an acceptable frame rate, especially with the enemy monster, the Behemoth, that featured 2,000 polygons on it alone. However, the other major problem was the cart size. Being that this is an RPG, it would be a big game in comparison to the N64's planned games that were mainly platformers or adventure games. A regular N64 cartridge at launch could provide between 4 to 12 megabytes of space, a very small amount for a game of this caliber. However, Nintendo was also making an add-on for the N64 called the 64 disk drive. This would let developers make games on 64 megabyte magnetic discs. A lot better than the regular size, but it was still nowhere near enough for what Squaresoft wished to make, as they also wished to feature many pre-rendered backgrounds and FMV cutscenes that would drastically increase the size of the game on top of the long game they were planning. In fact, Squaresoft believed they would require well over 30 magnetic discs to achieve what was just 2 PlayStation discs worth of content. The team was between a rock and a hard place of somehow making this dream game on this limited machine, especially since they had their relationship with Nintendo at jeopardy otherwise. However, while in this hard spot, an unlikely friendly face showed up with open arms to this company with a deal they couldn't refuse.
Hi, how are you?
If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell to support us and keep creating new videos. With a new console on the market, Nintendo had another competitor on the market too, the Sony PlayStation. Sony had been working hard for the past few years on gathering many major and minor third-party studios to make games for their platform in order to not be another failed console like many before them, while also providing said third-party with a safe haven free from tough constraints put on them by first-party developers, namely Nintendo, and providing a powerful enough machine that runs on high-capacity discs to make whatever game they wish. During 1995, Squaresoft was in a jam with how they could make their dream game, Final Fantasy VII, a reality with N64's tough limitations. The team was at this point considering other consoles, as virtually anything else of that generation had proper disk space, whether it be Sega's new Saturn system or even the idea of making Final Fantasy VII a PC game altogether. But soon, amongst Sony's contact to third-party developers, they visited Squaresoft and offered to work with them in making their game for their PlayStation console. Intrigued with this proposition, Squaresoft and the team put together some tests on the Sony PlayStation, handling both the disk capacity needed, even if disk switching was required, and even handling those high polygonal models for battles without a drop in frame rate. The decision was very clear for the team. While executives saw eye to eye with Sakaguchi and his team, a major hurdle was still ahead of them, facing Nintendo to tell them this awful news. And so, Hironobu Sakaguchi, the president of Squaresoft Masafumi Miyamoto, and lead programmer Ken Narita set up a meeting with the infamous iron-fisted president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi. Hiroshi Yamauchi was well known to third-party developers as basically a tyrant who had placed many restrictions on them on what they can develop, how much they can develop, and even who can sell their games. So as such, when the trio met with Yamauchi, who greeted them very warmly with an expensive bento meal and beer, that is when they broke the news to him that Final Fantasy VII was now being made for the Sony PlayStation. Yamauchi stayed professional to this revelation and simply wished them the best with their endeavors. To Sakaguchi, the meeting went better than expected as no bitter feelings were exchanged. but in reality, Nintendo was rather furious. In fact, it went as far as Nintendo making more or less passive-aggressive remarks to Squaresoft, stating, "Oh, we don't need that," and that Nintendo's philosophy being that their platform exists for their own first-party games, and if third-party developers also wish to make games on it, they would go, "Okay, you can do it." And if they don't want to do it, then they go, "We don't want you." It was clear, a major bridge had been burnt. What was once a very strong tide that started back on the NES, that in fact practically saved them with their first Final Fantasy game, was now gone. But at long last, Squaresoft was now free to develop the very game they wanted without limits, and now on the Sony PlayStation. With the shift to the PlayStation, the game saw a massive reboot, with Yoshinori Kitase as the game's de facto director, coming in from Final Fantasy VI, and co-writing alongside Kazushige Nojima, who themselves was coming fresh from Bahamut Lagoon, had Sakaguchi now in more of a producer role. Nojima and Kitase's first task was a complete overhaul of the plot, which soon the story was pushed back into more of a fantasy setting. Gone was the New York setting, and rather now in a world that was described as ambiguously futuristic, a place called Midgar. While it kept a lot of the modern designs of New York, the city was reimagined in a sort of pizza shape, originally envisioned in the idea that it was designed by cultured civilians who wished to escape the world below that was running out of Mako. This idea soon evolved into just being a separation between the slums and the modern city. However, the idea for New York City and the detective story were eventually repurposed for Squaresoft's other game, Parasite Eve. But with the game being in a fantasy setting once more, it opened a lot more wiggle room on how they want to spin it. With that came the idea of having the city run by the Shinra Electric Company, while the team that wished to destroy the very Mako reactors was given the name of Avalanche. The group from the get-go included the protagonist Cloud Strife and team member Barrett Wallace, as well as the heroine Aerith Gainsborough. To design such characters, longtime serious artist Yoshitaka Amano began several designs of such characters, but this time Amano had an already packed schedule as he was opening an art workshop and exhibition in New York and France. Despite getting some work done, a search for a new artist was needed. By that point, Squaresoft designer Tetsuya Nomura, who was involved with already pitching various ideas for the story, was someone who had piqued Sakaguchi's interest. While many delivered printed text documents to him, Nomura handed everything to him in handwritten text with small illustrations. It may have been a small gesture, but that got Sakaguchi interested in his art. And so Nomura was now tasked with drawing these new characters in his art style, drawing them in both a less stylized manner and chibi manner as well that could be used by staff to design the characters. While characters like Cloud Strife went through several differences, including having a more slicked back hair originally, this went as far as to even try to decide on what his proportions would be, to even having darker skin in one instance, let alone designing Cloud's Buster Sword in various ways, including one that had it in a blood red tone. Meanwhile, a character named Blow, who would be later named to Barrett Wallace, was designed as a take on Mr. T, and originally had a block-here design and even carried a machine gun in his regular hand too, aside from his already machine gun arm. However, Nomura wasn't just set as a basic artist at that point, as he kept up with providing ideas for the creative process, including giving every playable character a special attack that they'd use when a certain gauge would fill up, called a limit break, leading to the creation of unique and different ones each character would have. However, the story was now expanded beyond just a simple eco-terrorist group versus an evil corporation story, especially with the old antagonistic detective character out of the picture. A new character had to be introduced, something never seen before in the series: the villain Sephiroth. Sephiroth was designed with the idea of being a character that the team would continuously pursue, whose goals involved taking control of the planet and becoming one with the game's other new concept, the Lifestream. The Lifestream was perceived as a plane where the dead in Final Fantasy VII go and become one with the planet. This was a concept that Hironobu Sakaguchi proposed due to the loss of his mother back when she died during the development of Final Fantasy VI, a means of coping with her death by exploring the theme of life with this game. But along with that, Sephiroth's backstory involved another character by the name of Aerith Gainsborough, the lead heroine of the game. Made as a flower girl on introduction, but was initially being designed as Sephiroth's sister, which both Yoshitaka Amano and later Nomura even designed the two to have a resemblance, especially in the hair department. However, the story beat was eventually changed to Sephiroth just being Aerith's previous lover to further deepen her backstory, which together with that comes the game's other villainous element, Jenova. Jenova in early stages of development was a state of being, or rather an untapped portion of the brain rather than an actual character, and the idea was that if this Jenova part of the brain was unlocked, they'd unlock special abilities or senses such as the sensitivities to one's thoughts. Either one was born with it, which would in this instance have been Aerith in the original pitch, or with exposure to Mako would unlock it, thus Sephiroth at this stage. However, Jenova soon evolved past that into an actual physical being an alien from space that the team would pursue, and at that stage, Sephiroth was actually a manifestation of Jenova that they were chasing here, and that the rest of Jenova split itself apart and manifested as black cloaked figures that would be approaching this version of Sephiroth, whether it be her arm or even her heart. In fact, all that would remain by the time of reaching Sephiroth at the Whirlwind Maze would be Jenova's floating heart, moving as a faceless black cloak. Related to Jenova in all this was also this Switch character that Nomura was drawing up to. Not too much is known about her, but theories have went as far as to say that she may have been designed as a servant of Jenova, a cult leader of Jenova, or even the final form of Jenova to be faced as the final boss. Whatever she was meant to be, she was scrapped and left to be used in the next entry as a more prominent villain. That and Jenova soon changed into being more of a character that Sephiroth took control of and would manifest in his bid to reaching his goals. But going back to our protagonist, he was now getting a major development in his story. In developing Cloud's backstory, Nojima contributed to the idea of Cloud having a very unclear idea of his past, to the point of misremembering it and even developing split personalities. This in turn created the character Zack, a character who Cloud would think he was in the past. In fact, Zack's design seemingly may have originated in taking Cloud's original design with the slick back hairstyle, but black instead. And with the introduction of Zack, Sephiroth was replaced as Aerith's former lover and instead became someone in Cloud's own past that he would have to deal with. Eventually, the theme of life was coming to a crux within Sakaguchi's game. Feeling it was not enough to make life the theme, you need to depict living and dying. In any event, you need to portray death. For this, the team decided that someone had to die. But at this point, the team only had 3 playable characters. You couldn't kill Cloud as he was the protagonist, leaving only Barrett and Aerith as their choices. The team as such got into a hot debate over who should die, with some going with Barrett dying, while Tetsuya Nomura proposing that Aerith should die. Ultimately, the decision was made. Aerith must die. The decision to kill her was one that director Yoshinori Kitase felt would be very unexpected and surprising, whereby he stated that it would leave not a dramatic feeling, but great emptiness, feeling of reality and not Hollywood. In contrast, Barrett would be almost too expected to die. The series tends to have a trope up to that point, whereby the brave, kind hero would end up sacrificing himself, much as seen in games such as Final Fantasy V. However, while it was agreed upon that this would be the direction the game would go in, it created another problem. The heroine was now dead. As a result, a new heroine was now required to be written in, rather than let it become just a group of men. Up to this point, the game followed a flowchart of character relationships to one another. When Aerith was decided not to be Sephiroth's sister, a character by the name of Tifa Lockhart had been designed with the idea of potentially filling in that role. In the search for a new heroine, Tifa was taken and now made into a playable character, written as Cloud's childhood friend that would from the get-go be with Avalanche, but as well open the doors to the idea of a love triangle with both Tifa and Aerith as rivals for Cloud's affection, something that Kitase liked as it would be very new to the franchise. But from there, more of the cast started to be introduced. One character that existed in very early Amano art was a red dog-like creature. When Tetsuya Nomura was in charge of bringing him in as a playable character, he struggled with the idea as he had no idea of how this character character would even climb ladders, let alone the fact that he might even clip through walls. But Nomura gave him the name Red 13, as it means to be a name that doesn't really sound like a name, yet also having the real name of Nanaki as part of his backstory. Others included the pilot character Sid Hidewind, following the trope of characters in the series known as Sid, the ninja character Yuffie Kisaragi, who was originally made as a 25-year-old ex-soldier, much like Cloud, but originally pursuing both Cloud and Sephiroth for their bounties. Her design stayed relatively the same, but the colors were changed up, and her role was simplified to joining them to try to steal from them. Kate Sith was another character made as a robot controlled by Shinra insider Reeves. Originally made as a spy, whereby the bonds Reeves has with the party would have torn him on who he should side with. Something changed him just trying to take down Shinra from the inside. But one of the longest developments to a character was in the form of Vincent Valentine. Existing since Amano's early art of him, and the character flowchart even showcasing that his design was at one point even considered for Sephiroth, his roles changed several times, from being a horror researcher to a chemist and even a detective, which may or may not have been related to the original detective of the game. As a detective though, he was one originally set to be working on mostly bogus supernatural cases, with his last job being on trying to expose Shinra to the world for the benefit of a rival company. Meanwhile, his backstory being one of knowing Professor Hojo from the days of Midgar University's medical department and the Shinra research lab, whereby he tries to investigate Hojo's work through Hojo's assistant Lucrezia, but ultimately leads to tragedy, with Hojo capturing her and using her for the Genova project, while Hojo puts Vincent into a 30-year sleep when he tries to rescue her. Waking up in modern day and seeing all the experiments done to him to his surprise, including the ability to transform into monsters for battle. Eventually, he was finalized as just being a former member of Shinra's intelligence agency, the Turks, with his backstory tweaked further regarding his relationship with Hojo, Lucrezia, and his monstrous powers. In fact, his weaponry was completely different too, having a scythe initially, before given a gun. Ultimately though, more plans were being designed around death, including the idea of killing off the whole cast by the end of the game, even before the final battle, something that Nomura stood strongly against and vetoed, as it would only cheapen Aerith's death. And as the game's story and platform rounded out, it was now time for the game to finally start being built on the PlayStation hardware, that very hardware they had to sacrifice a long-lasting relationship with Nintendo to work on, and would still have to pull many tricks and sacrifices to get the game deemed by many as impossible to become a functional game, especially on the idea of how the game should even look. Knowing that they were making a three-dimensional game from the get-go while the scripting was being finalized, the challenge came about how to render the game in the third dimension. While the Nintendo 64 definitely provided the polygons needed in shaping a fully 3D environment, the PlayStation had a much tougher time doing that with a much lower polygon count. In order to continue using polygons, the team started leaning towards the idea of using 2D sprites against a 3D background. It would provide not just detailed characters, but as well still can create a cinematic game in combination with the environment, an approach games like Xenogears were taking, which were in concurrent development at Squaresoft. However, head staff, including the game's director Yoshinori Kitase, vetoed the idea. The ambition behind this entry was to make it more of a cinematic game, and felt that they wouldn't be able to make a realistic drama with 2D sprites. While the team wasn't thrilled, including the game's art director Yusuke Naura, who felt his job was now at risk, as all he knew up to then was drawing in 2D, the team ultimately agreed. And so Naura and the team took up CG training sessions to learn on how to develop with 3D visuals with cinematics in mind. This including learning and taking duties of modeling and animation of 3D characters, texturing, creating environments, and various visual effects. But the problem still stood. How do you render a fully 3D RPG on the underpowered PlayStation? As with the troubles of how to solve Resident Evil's technical problems, the answer was clear. Look to the foreign game Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark used what are known as pre-rendered backgrounds, a set of flat images with a realistic environment rendered to them, starting with a mesh layer to map out where the character could walk and the camera set over it, along with a flat image that would be layered on top of it, with the 3D character walking in front of that image to make it look like as if they are walking in that very environment. Therefore, rather than have 2D characters against 3D, it was 3D characters against a 2D background to solve the polygonal issue. But even then, Sakaguchi felt that there was a need to use two different models between field and battles. A field model, which would be reflective of 2D Final Fantasy games, keeping a more chibi or super deformed model, a decision Sakaguchi felt was necessary, as the larger proportions of the head would better convey emotions than try to see it on a face of a more realistic model. As a result, various expressions were being designed for the characters to display on the field, especially with their eyes, including blinking animations, some that even went unused, like 3 of Cloud's expressions, with one that included a more tired expression and one that was a more happier out of character one. Plans even went as far as to even include mouths, but ultimately weren't used until the PC version. On the flip side, battles would have realistic models that would convey the art style of Tetsuya Nomura, perfect for swinging weapons without stabbing their larger deformed heads. And so, with the art style and graphics decided on, the team purchased high-powered Silicon Graphics Onyx supercomputers along with various related software and gear, a cost that would rack up to $21 million US. But the key to all this was that the game was to be cinematic. During the scripting stages of the game, storyboards were being drawn up for such details. Designer Tetsuya Nomura had already been deeply involved in the creative process and even came up with the limit break system, was drawing up on how each of these limit breaks would even look. This even extended to drawing the various camera angles that would go into performing attacks in battle, casting magic, and even various unique camera angles that summons would have. But outside of battle, because the game's field scenes were going to be using a fixed camera angle against a pre-rendered background, it would make cinematic and moving camera angles an impossibility. But director Yoshinori Kitase was hell-bent on taking that story and making it work in a highly cinematic fashion. Much like another acclaimed director in the industry, Kitase was a major film buff and wanted to bridge storytelling between video games and films. For this, the idea was to use full motion videos, or FMVs for short, an industry staple at the time, to show pre-recorded movie files within a game to better tell a story in a more cinematic fashion. With disc technology, this was indeed a possibility on the PlayStation. For that, Squaresoft opened a new subsidiary to develop highly polished FMVs using computer graphics called Visual Works. While Visual Works would develop an initial concept for the FMV, utilizing a storyboard with simple polygons in place, the actual FMVs were made with a team of internationally hired talents from North America and Japan, utilizing major Hollywood artists that worked on properties including Jurassic Park, Terminator, and even Star Wars. And so a whopping 40 hours of FMV cutscenes were made for the game, pushing the PlayStation's disk space so much the game now required 3 discs to run on. Once again, a feat that only became doable now thanks to the PlayStation's ability to allow for switching discs. But in addition to that, another sort of FMV cutscenes were being made, whereby the gameplay would seamlessly transition from in-game to an FMV cutscene, keeping the chibi models to use for such scenes, the only compromise possible to do in-field cinematic cutscenes as a result. And this was all done with Sakaguchi's iron-fisted rule that it had to run without any load times. Otherwise, a load time would ruin the transition to a seamless FMV cutscene. But aside from these, the game was getting many other further polishes in terms of building a more cinematic experience, including working with a motion specialist to get animations just right, making real-time effects over what were pre-rendered backgrounds to give the environment more life, hand-drawn at times even, to get it just right, and on top of that, trying to make those varied backgrounds as detailed as possible. A daunting task, as director Kitase would describe, this being with how detailed they had to be to the point of going through several revisions to get their final versions, such as this one from the early game during the bombing mission, where it was flat initially, but given the real-time effect of glowing lights by the end, let alone the mesh for it also getting larger too by the final game. And then there's the elevator in this area, having its VFX altered altogether by adding floor numbers to it by the end, as well as some of the lights just not being there anymore. The tower area that followed even had environmental changes done, whereby on the top, the grates were removed, a brick wall had a panel covering it, and the dome was hollowed out. The area with the ladders received a much greater environmental change, with entire platforms removed on the bottom right here, these hanging bits off the top here, and in general numerous wires, pipes, and differing wall textures textures added all over. Though it appears that this version may have been reutilized for the Sector 5 reactor later on, even though that did receive some changes too by the end, including different lighting and the removal of that bottom platform too. The mesh especially changed heavily. While it was a straightforward walk originally, it was changed to Cloud jumping around a lot and actually using the ladder too, even in the Sector 5 version. Top that off with several of the backgrounds simply going unused, including one for a northern crater, an empty cargo ship, this hill one called Trap, and even ones like this Great Glacier having this tall unused background that were even seen in previews of the game. As well, there were transitional backgrounds that would lead into an FMV cutscene, like this one called Junmon, which is believed to be made as the transitional background into the Sapphire Weapon cutscene in Junon, or even one called XMV Tess that leads to the scene in the livestream, or Falpi, which would lead to the FMV of President Rufus being taken down. And sometimes there were even areas of final pre-renders that just weren't used, like this one in the Sleeping Forest that has this unused cave here on the right side that one was to get to via climbing this vine, or Stranger being at the bottom of this prison well that has this red man hidden here, which in the final game all you see is a treasure chest here, the purpose of which is unknown, but this very area was an area that was being known to test battle elements too, such as this test monster called Test Zero that was fought here. Even in the final Japanese release of the game, to further test and debug the game, numerous test rooms were made featuring the game's cast that can be spoken to do everything from exploring various areas of the game, watching any cutscenes, getting various items such as all the materia, and even carrying over your stats into a new game, kind of like a developer's only New Game Plus. While the limit break element was planned and added to the development of the battle system, numerous aspects of the system were still in the works. While in most previous games, each character had their own personal skills that they would learn as they level up. But this time it was decided that battles wouldn't be about the individual's innate skills. This is where the creation of Materias came in. Spherical items that the characters would equip to use different abilities, whether it be magics, buffs, or even summons. Any character could equip them, and how battles flowed would change depending on the combination with said character used. Nomura proposed to simply call them spheres, but Sakaguchi suggested the name Materia as it would better resonate with people, including elementary school kids. And there were many made, some that even went unused, including the booster materia, which is one that is theorized to have boosted your ability points on a materia when attached to that very materia. Then there are some materias that teach singular or dual skills that were combined with others to make a more useful materia. The first one being the law materia, which teaches guild toss, something that is part of the throw materia in the final game, which also lets you throw weapons. There is also the M barrier materia that teaches the magic barrier command, and also there is the reflect materia that will teach reflect and wall, all of which were grouped together to make the barrier materia that teaches all 4 skills. An interesting one is the reflect absorb materia, which is speculated as a countermeasure to enemies who use reflect, basically dispel, which was a part of the destruct materia by the final game. And like with other Final Fantasy games, elements such as fire, thunder, ice, and many more were included in a weakness and resistance system. 9 of them in total, in fact. However, a 10th one was being planned too. It was something the developers even spoke about in interviews about a 10th element, but was eventually dummied out. However, traces of it stayed into the final game, with Ultimate Weapon's Ultima Beam still being mapped to it. However, the 10th element does nothing, despite being attached to it, but at one point it is possible that this existed to be resisted by an item or ability that they were planning against Ultimate Weapon, which with that, enemies were well in the planning to be faced, many of which also saw them being changed and altered. For example, the Hochu and the Tonberry enemies that can only be fought at the battle square were also intended to appear elsewhere, with Hochu in the Ancient Forest and the Tonberry in the Whirlwind Maze and Northern Crater. Along with enemies comes hidden abilities that didn't make it to the final game, such as the Dual Horns ability that cost a whopping 64,535 MP to use. It targets a random friend or foe and does no damage. Likely a dummied out skill with MP set too high for it to use without actually removing it completely and breaking the game. The other is the Acrophes, which has a nearly unused skill called Isogen Smog. that damages the party and casts darkness. Problem is that the party already has to be entirely under the effect of darkness for it to even use it. But one aspect the series is best known for is the music. The music of this series up to this point was solely composed by the genius of Nobuo Uematsu and was working on the 7th entry too. Originally, Uematsu wanted to take advantage of the PlayStation's capabilities of producing CD quality audio and have music with vocal performances too. This, however, had to be scrapped due to how it would make loading times between areas take much longer due to the bigger audio files that it would have to load, and thus stuck to the console's own internal sound sequencer to produce music much as he had with previous Final Fantasy games. Granted, the difference this time being that the PlayStation offered a whopping 24 channels of audio to work with, as opposed to the SNES, which only offered 8. As a result, Uematsu was able to approach this like he was approaching a movie score, making it better reflect the story being told. As such, Uematsu was shown scenes from the game and told to make said tracks for them, starting with the bombing mission as the beginning, but as well as making some very defining tracks meant for specific scenes to better convey the emotion of said scenes, including Aerith's death, with his intention being for it to feel sad but beautiful, and what might be his magnum opus, One Winged Angel. While simply stuck using the PlayStation's internal sound sequencer, he used a large number of high-quality digitized vocals in making this, the first game ever to do so, and fitting for the game's final battle. As the clock ticked to the release date of 1996, the team had to adjust and cut down some ideas, this firstly affecting Vincent Valentine and Yuffie, who were being made with the intention of being encountered as part of the story, but had to be pushed into becoming optional characters and not required as a part of the main narrative anymore. This was to the point of even an alternate FMV ending that they were producing. Initially, it was to include both Yuffie and Vincent, but as they were optional now, that original one was scrapped, and a version was made without them. Plans did exist for an alternate version of the FMV for if you had unlocked Yuffie and or Vincent, but with how long the final cutscene is, it would require an additional 4th disc at that point, and thus was scrapped. But aside from that cut, further polish was being given to the game, including the battle UI that originally had more information at the top of the screen was now removed, along with updating these very character models, especially Cloud's, whose Buster Sword saw one last revision to become even bigger and his hair getting spikier. The end screen, which originally used 2D sprites exclusively made for each character, was simply changed to their official art, even redoing entire pre-rendered backgrounds in order to have the camera readjusted like for the opening area of the bombing mission, or even remaking them when redesigning an entire area, such as the Cosmo Canyon, where it rearranged some of its huts and added ladders and further lighting, or even Nibelheim, which did a complete redesign and even added a water tower in the middle to further flesh out Tifa and Cloud's relationship. The game at this point was becoming a highly anticipated game, despite the console switch to the Sony PlayStation at the time, to the point of Squaresoft CEO Tomoyuki Takechi feeling certain about its success in Japan. As a result, a demo of the game was offered as a bundle in the fighting game called Tobal No. 1 on August 2nd, 1996 in Japan. The demo just covered the opening bombing mission, but had one major difference of letting you use Aerith in battles alongside Cloud and Barret, something that was not possible in the final game, a way of giving the players a taste of using 3 characters on screen at once. This along with several late game spells and even summons too. But that didn't stop there, as at the August Tokyo Game Show 1996 event, they also had a playable demo given out called Square's Preview Extras, Final Fantasy VII and Sigref 95 Works. A mouthful, but as the title suggests, not only was that the same playable demo of the opening bombing mission included, but as well included the original N64 demo that was shown off at Sigref 1995 for the public to own. And following that even came some early marketing of the Western version of Final Fantasy VII with the release of Tobal No. 1 in North America on August 31st, 1996, which carried that same Aerith demo. But the game, while getting close to completion, still needed further polishing, and so it was agreed to push the game's release date back to January 31st, 1997. During the game's development, the game was seeing a bit of risque content added. This scenario was being written by event planner Motomu Toriyama. Toriyama was already an individual responsible for much of the early Midgar sections of the game, including the bombing mission that followed the Sector 7 plate, and this section called the Honeybee Inn. The section itself was literally about a red light district and a full-on brothel, going as far as to even include Cloud in drags as a means to infiltrate it. However, with how sleazy this section was becoming, staff were starting to raise a brow with how far Toriyama was taking this. Eventually, he was told that that's going too far. But instead of removing that section, it was to be toned down and made more ambiguous on being a brothel. Initially, the Honeybee Inn had 2 floors, with the first floor cut out and the second becoming the default floor, with the employee room replacing one of the rooms in the second floor. And the reason why the first floor was cut was entirely because that is where the extreme scenarios that Toriyama had written took place. On entry to the original first floor, it is very explicit that it is a brothel, with pictures of women on the wall, no Tifa being a part of that selection too, and a selection for how long you want to be with one of these women, including a 30-minute course and a crazy long 150-minute course. Of course, the game actually allowed you to line up, whereby one sees all the scenarios of each bee coming out for the next customer in a very seductive manner, speaking in very colorful text. The first guy simply passing out from a floating kiss, where Cloud simply shrugs. The next scenario would involve Shinra executive Palmer coming over for another course, as the regular customer that he apparently is, which goes on to him having an interaction with the Shinra employee in front of Cloud, scolding him for even just coming to the place, leading to Palmer chasing out that very employee. This scenario also features a piece of music that was exclusively used here, that went unused as such once the scenario was cut out, and afterwards Cloud is let in and into the second floor, whereby we get the map that becomes the first floor in the final game. There were also 2 other floors in the first floor too related to this. The first one on the left simply involves the girls coming out, making that the employee room. The other on the right is the waiting area for, of course, all the men waiting for their courses. Even a character named Quedge, who was supposed to be Wedge's brother, all nervous as he could be. The second floor, while it contained much of the same rooms, the 2 rooms on the right are locked and contains only 3 rooms, which the final game simply duplicated 2 of the rooms to cover the 2 other doors. Altogether though, with being this raunchy, it was cut down and believed by the team to now be in a more presentable state for the final game. And so the game released on that very date on January 31st, 1997. Up to this point, the PlayStation had been lagging behind the N64, but that changed as Final Fantasy VII became its de facto killer app, having a 50% attach rate at selling 2 million copies to 4 million PlayStation owners at the time in just a span of 3 days, selling PlayStations out in Japan in fact leading up to the game's release. And of course, not just was it a commercial success, but a critical one too, with Famitsu magazine even giving it a very solid 38 out of 40 score. While it was an obvious success in Japan, North America was going to be another beast, with Squaresoft's lack of any major success there. At the time, Sony, who was also struggling against the Nintendo 64 and to an extent the Sega Saturn North America, saw the potential of Final Fantasy VII and how it could become the PlayStation's very killer app to overcome this competition. As a result, Sony made a deal with Square to publish this game on their behalf and even offered them royalties equal to what they would have received if they self-published. And so the development of the Western version of Final Fantasy VII was underway. For this, Squaresoft decided to start fresh and shut down their offices in Washington and open up a new office in Costa Mesa, California. Originally, the translator of Final Fantasy VI, or known as 3 in North America at the time, Ted Woosley, was invited to continue his role on the next entry, a localizer well known for his memorable quotes, such as Kefka's "son of a submariner." However, he turned it down due to personal reasons. So producer Hironobu Sakaguchi proposed that the game's English translation to be done in-house by the original Japanese team. What happened instead was a collaboration between the publisher Sony Computer Entertainment America and Squaresoft working jointly to localize. The localization was as such being handled by SCEA's associate producer Seth Luisi. Starting along with bringing in a team of 50 people for localizing it, with Michael Baskett, a recurring translator at Square, who was the director of localization for Chrono Trigger as well, but there were mistakes. Nothing is wrong with Michael Baskett himself, but he literally was the only translator in-house. Even though he was still receiving assistance from Japanese staff too, the team was struggling due to the number of inexperienced localizers or even professional editors on board. This leading to badly translated dialogue that was grammatically terrible, let alone a number of dialogue just not having the correct meaning, or dialogue being completely rewritten at times to something incomprehensible. A lot of this was also due to the heavy technical issues that they were facing with the engine coded to basically just work in Japanese, leading the team to recode the engine to have more character limits to ease it off, but even then, they still couldn't program it to spell check, as it wasn't programmed to cache English words and needed to be done manually. This, along with the terrible communication overall between Squaresoft American and Japanese offices, leading to meanings of certain names being lost in translation, most famously the name Aerith, which a Japanese team intended to be just that, as a combination of the name air and earth, something that fits Aerith's whole motif and character. Instead, it was translated to the more literal common Western name Aerith. Luisi, during this process, noted how tough it was for properly translating direct Japanese to English and making it sound natural, and so in an unconventional attempt of making sentences sound more natural, they decided to add a lot of swearing, as they felt it would better convey the Japanese meaning. Of course, you can't just drop in F-bombs in what was being aimed at a teen-rated game. As such, those words had to appear censored on screen, while still looking like they were swearing. For that, they used a classic comic book style swearing, whereby they replaced a word with several symbols. On the flip side, the European version wasn't even being handled by Squaresoft nor Sony, but rather given to a third party to handle, and was in even worse condition. While the localization was a nightmare, it was however receiving additional content. These included some simple stuff like a more cleaned up UI in menu screens, rebalancing enemies such as Gin Natak becoming immune to sleep and poison, along with less encounter rates, as well as bigger changes like new cutscenes, including flashback cutscenes of Zack and Cloud together to further flesh out that story, along with a new boss battle against Diamond Weapon, who originally only appeared in a cutscene. This along with two new bosses that appear in Disc 3 called Emerald Weapon and Ruby Weapon, which together with Emerald Weapon came the new underwater materia to remove the timer for the Emerald Weapon underwater battle. Otherwise, several other miscellaneous changes were being made, such as simplifying the clock puzzle from the Temple of the Ancients. With localization well underway, Seth Luisi's other task was the marketing for the game. Firstly, it was decided that this time, that despite it being only the fourth entry released outside of Japan, Final Fantasy VII was to keep its numeric number 7. Unlike the previous entries like 4 becoming 2 and 6 becoming 3, it was all consistent now. But the bigger task that Luisi set out to do was deemed as the impossible: make a JRPG sell in North America, a feat that was never achieved prior, as it was a rather niche genre up to that point, with expectations for the game only being at between 30,000 to 50,000 units selling. And with that, Square and Sony launched a massive 3-month campaign in August 1997, running commercials alongside major TV programs, including The Simpsons and SNL, let alone a ton of adverts and articles published via gaming magazines and comics. This followed up by various collaborations with various brands, including Pepsi and even Zippo Lighter, as well as giving out a second playable demo for the game via PlayStation Underground magazine. It was a lot like the original demo packed with Tobal number 1 that featured Aerith, but instead had Tifa for the opening bombing mission. But the game saw its true showcase at E3 1997, showing a new trailer and even another playable demo, this one actually being based off the final game, with only Cloud and Barret alone being playable in the bombing mission. While all was going well in building hype for the game, Sony was getting nervous about one particular piece of content in the game, the Honeybee Inn. At the time, during localization of a game in the West, it was was the norm to change content of the game that was deemed too sensitive for Westerners, and Sony had set its eye on that very brothel. Despite already being toned down by the developers as they even thought it was going too far, it wasn't enough for Sony as the game's publisher. In an announcement, it was announced that the Honey Bee Inn might very well get cut for the Western release. This did not sit well with Western fans, leading to Sony being piled with numerous long letters, petitions, and even being hit over the head with the right of free speech mentioned in the First Amendment. Sony, playing damage control, tried to state that no actual decision had been made, but couldn't deny a change was proposed. But eventually, Sony backpedaled, and Squaresoft firmly stated that they never allow Sony to censor their game. And so the Honey Bee Inn survived into the Western game, and thus the game remained uncut for release. And so at long last, Final Fantasy VII released on September 7, 1997 in North America, and with how much Sony had banked on it, it truly paid off, selling a whopping 330,000 copies in just its opening weekend, becoming the game with the best opening weekend yet at the time, trumping even Star Fox 64, who held the title previously at 300,000 copies sold in its opening weekend. And the game went on to sell 1 million copies by December 1997, and bigger yet is that this became the very game to make the PlayStation finally overtake the Nintendo 64 in North America. A system seller, a clear killer app that finally set the PlayStation on a much higher plane than the Nintendo 64 worldwide. Nintendo had indeed failed grandly in securing the game with their very decision to stick to cartridges on top of also having odd hardware that they couldn't work with, and this had cost them dearly. In fact, President Yamauchi was still furious at the situation at hand, that even years later in 1999, he would comment that people who play RPGs are depressed gamers who like to sit alone in their dark rooms and play slow games, with the slow games clearly referring to RPGs, which the N64 sorely lacked. And this bad blood would stay between Squaresoft and Nintendo for years to come, and of course critical reception was incredibly high with this game, scoring many perfect and near perfect scores across the board. Some publications, including GameFan, would even declare it as, quite possibly, the greatest game ever made, something that would even make it onto the back of the game's box. Others, such as GameSpot, highlighting its feat in bringing together gameplay, technology, and storytelling so well, while those of Edge magazine specifically bringing up how its story, being as good and complex as it was, brought it as close as possible to becoming an interactive movie. Final Fantasy VII had done what no other Final Fantasy game, or JRPG for that matter, could, becoming a true success in the West. While it had a ludicrous $20 million ad campaign in North America, while Japan and Europe only saw $10 million spent apiece, it had paid off with flying colors. The success of the Western version of Final Fantasy VII led to a re-release of Final Fantasy VII in Japan on October 2nd, 1997, called Final Fantasy VII International, which would, as the title states, use the international Western version as a basis and include all its updates, including the new boss fights, cutscenes, and other updates, but as well a new fourth disc called Final Fantasy VII Perfect Files that included many small extras, from concept art to character info, maps, and much more. This shortly being followed by the European release on November 17, 1999, and interestingly, a PC version in 1998 developed by Eidos, which the PC version fixed many translation errors and even badly translated dialogue, this together with some reshading of the game and even giving characters the mouth graphic that was cut for the PlayStation release, for better or for worse. As the years went by, the Final Fantasy series kept going with its hot new popularity worldwide, coming out with many more entries over the years, and eventually a movie that would follow up on Final Fantasy VII called Advent Children, launching a new compilation of Final Fantasy VII sub-series, whereby many new spin-off games would come out for Final Fantasy VII alone, from prequels to sequels. And eventually a tech demo built for the PlayStation 3 was shown off, showcasing the opening of Final Fantasy VII with the PlayStation 3's graphical fidelity, exploding demands for a remake of Final Fantasy VII in such graphics, something that would eventually be fulfilled down the road in a 3-part remake of the series. And thank you so much for watching this 3-part series on Final Fantasy VII to completion. Hit the subscribe button for I'll plan to be back for more Final Fantasy and other games cut content and gaming history soon. Hit the like button and comment below on if you experienced that hype for the game in 1997 or if you wish you would have. So everyone, thank you for watching.